There's something quietly powerful about a character who doesn't bend just because the story needs them to. Someone who stays exactly who they are even when the world around them shifts, even when the conversation pushes and pulls and tries to reshape them. And that's one of the first things that really stands out when you spend time with All in the Family, especially when you begin to notice how much of its strength comes from consistency. From the idea that these characters are not going to suddenly transform into something more agreeable or more convenient, just to make the episode feel complete. And I keep thinking about one particular kind of situation that really brings that into focus. A recurring type of episode where the conversation revolves around work, responsibility, and pride. Something that feels very grounded in everyday life, but slowly opens up into something deeper. Something about identity and self-worth. And it usually begins in that same familiar living room, where everything feels both casual and loaded at the same time. Archie comes home from work, tired, maybe a little irritated, maybe carrying something that happened during the day, and he settles into his chair like it's the one place where he can reestablish control, where things make sense again. And at first, it might seem like a quiet evening, like nothing much is going to happen. But then something small shifts. Maybe Mike mentions something about his own work or his plans. Maybe it's a conversation about education, about what kind of job matters, about what kind of effort deserves respect. And suddenly Archie is listening more closely, because this touches something personal, something tied to how he sees himself. And when he responds, it's immediate, it's firm, it's rooted in that same worldview he carries into every situation. The belief that hard work in the way he understands it is the foundation of everything, and anything that challenges that feels like a threat, not just to an idea, but to his identity. Mike pushes back, of course, because for him, work isn't just about physical effort or traditional roles. It's about opportunity, about growth, about questioning the structures that define what counts as valuable. And his perspective is just as consistent as Archie's, just as rooted in his own experiences and beliefs. Gloria feels the tension almost immediately because she understands both sides in different ways. She sees her father's pride and her husband's ideals, and she tries to navigate that space, sometimes smoothing things over, sometimes getting pulled into the conflict herself. And as always, brings that quiet presence into the room, that softness that doesn't erase the disagreement but changes how it feels, offering small moments of understanding that keep everything from becoming too sharp, too harsh. What's fascinating is how none of them shift in a dramatic way. None of them suddenly adopt a completely new perspective. Instead, they remain consistent. And that consistency is what drives the entire scene. Archie doesn't soften his stance just because Mike makes a good point. Mike doesn't back down just because Archie is forceful. Gloria doesn't suddenly resolve the tension with a perfect solution, and doesn't magically fix everything with kindness alone. And that might sound like it would make the conversation feel repetitive, but it does the opposite. It makes it feel real, because the tension comes from the clash of these consistent personalities, from the way they interact over time. The living room becomes this kind of stage where that consistency plays out, where the same core beliefs meet again and again in different situations, creating new variations of the same underlying conflict. And because the characters don't change in big, obvious ways, you start to notice the smaller shifts, the subtle reactions, the moments where someone pauses or hesitates or softens just slightly, even if they return to their original position afterward. Those small moments become meaningful because they exist within a framework of consistency. They stand out precisely because they're not the norm. The humor in these scenes comes from that dynamic, from the way these consistent personalities collide, from the predictability of certain reactions combined with the unpredictability of how they'll play out in a given moment. You might find yourself anticipating how Archie will respond, and then laughing at the exact way he does it, or at how Mike chooses to challenge him this time, or at how Gloria reacts, or how gently shifts the tone. But that humor is always tied to something deeper, something slightly uncomfortable, because it's rooted in real differences, real tensions, real beliefs that don't easily align. And that's part of what made All in the Family so groundbreaking, especially in the 1970s, when television often leaned toward characters who learned clear lessons and changed in visible ways by the end of an episode. This show took a different approach. It trusted that consistency could be just as powerful as change, that keeping characters true to themselves could create a more honest, more engaging kind of storytelling. It also allowed the show to explore social and cultural issues in a way that felt grounded, because the characters' reactions were shaped by who they were, not by what the story needed them to be. Archie's views reflected a certain perspective common in that era, a resistance to change, a reliance on tradition, and while those views were often challenged, they weren't erased, they remained part of the conversation. Mike's perspective represented a different side of that cultural moment, a push toward progress, toward questioning established norms, and his consistency gave that perspective a sense of stability and conviction. Gloria's position, caught between those two, reflected the emotional reality of living within that divide, and kindness offered a kind of emotional grounding that kept the show from becoming too harsh. As the conversation unfolds, it doesn't build toward a neat resolution. It builds toward a kind of understanding, not agreement, but an awareness of where everyone stands, of why they think the way they do. And that's where the show feels so different, because it doesn't try to solve the conflict. It lets it exist, it lets it breathe, it lets it shape the interactions. Watching it now, you can still feel how relevant that approach is, because people still hold onto their beliefs, still resist change, still challenge each other, and those interactions are rarely resolved in simple ways. There's something comforting about seeing that reflected honestly, about recognizing that consistency in character can lead to complexity in storytelling. As the scene winds down, there's often a sense of calm returning, not because anything has been fixed, but because the conversation has reached a natural pause. The characters settle back into their familiar roles. The room feels quieter, but the underlying tension remains, ready to resurface in another situation, another conversation. And that's what gives the show its lasting power, the sense that these interactions are ongoing, that they don't end with the episode, that they continue just out of view. Sitting with that, thinking about how much of the show's strength comes from that commitment to consistency, it becomes clear that this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice, a way of creating a world that feels real, that feels lived in. Because in real life, people don't change overnight. They don't abandon their beliefs just because they've been challenged. They carry those beliefs with them. They bring them into every conversation, every interaction. And All in the Family captures that in a way that still feels fresh, still feels honest, still feels worth paying attention to. So when you think about that living room, about those conversations, about the way the characters interact, it's not the plot that stands out. It's the people, the way they stay true to themselves, the way that consistency shapes everything that happens. And maybe that's why it stays with you, because it feels like something you've seen before, something you've experienced, something that continues to unfold in real life, in real conversations, in real relationships. And in that sense, the show doesn't just tell a story, it reflects one, ongoing, unresolved, and deeply human.